Hello and welcome everyone. I am Ariman and on behalf of Rickshaw, I'd like to welcome all of you to our first panel discussion of the semester titled Power on the Plate, Demystifying the Politics of Food. Before we begin, I'd like to request everyone to keep themselves on mute while the panelists are speaking. During the discussion round, you can either drop your questions in the chat box directly or indicate if you want to ask a question. We can then unmute you and request you to ask your question. Rickshaw is a students' collective at South Asian University, operating under the aegis of the Department of Sociology. It has students from across South Asia as its members. The orientation of the department is collectively South Asian, which gets reflected in our writings and interactions on critical, social, cultural, and political issues of the region. We also hope to inculcate a sociological imagination in our writing so as to ignite a passion for reflection and introspection in our audience. Rickshaw is not simply a space for academics in general or sociologists in particular. We collaborate with and extend a warm invitation to professionals from a diverse range of fields, academic or otherwise. Coming back to our topic today on food politics, today we are going to explore the way in which power flows through the food which lands up on our plate. Power, which flows through the food we consume, is often channelized via commodities which are consumed and the communities that facilitate this consumption. We are living in a world that has been shaped by capitalism and globalization. And when we walk down the food lanes in urban spaces in South Asia, for instance, a Bhutanese colony in Delhi or a Mughlai food lane in Bangladesh or Bhutan, we meet foods which we have considered ethnic or perhaps local in a heterogeneous space or enclave. What happens to the local or the ethnic here? How is the food mediated by power politics in diverse spaces? In an attempt to seek insights on these questions, we will go to our panel. The discussion will be chaired by Dr. Ishita De, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, New Delhi. Dr. De is a food sociologist with an interest in food studies, labor studies, and forced migration. Among other things, she has been working on the life of sweets and sweetness in South Asia. I now welcome Dr. Day to take over and introduce the panelists. Thank you.
A warm welcome to everyone. Uh, Today, I really thank Rickshaw and the student coordinators of the Rickshaw for facilitating this wonderful discussion. And this discussion was much needed. And some of us, internally have been having this discussion. And it actually gives me it's a wonderful privilege to introduce both Kiran and Chavi because I have worked with them or learned how to curate a course on food, actually from Kiran. Many of you might be knowing that I used to teach in Ambedkar University before, and at that point and prior to Kiran joining at IGNU, and I'll introduce her properly. Kiran actually ran, one of the very successful courses, optional course. It was an undergraduate course on food and society in India. And the learnings of those discussions were exactly around the politics of ethnic and local food, which actually Lovi and I have engaged with in the students in the class in one of the discussions. So it gives me great privilege to invite three distinguished panelists. Let me go in the order of today's speakers. So Dr. Kiranmay Bhushi is an associate professor at the Indira Gandhi National Open University. She teaches sociology there. And she's also someone who used to run a very successful restaurant called Gunpowder in Delhi, which also shows her engagement with the politics of food. Apart from that, her publications, one of the very, very well-known publications include a collection of a edited volume and sort of a very ambitious edited volume which includes interdisciplinary approaches on the themes related on diverse themes, and the title of the book is Farms to Fingers: The Culture and Politics of Food in India. Dr. Novidoli Jimo will be our second speaker, and she is right now an assistant professor of gender studies at the School of Human Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Dr. Jimo needs no introduction. She has worked on the politics of indigeneity and gender in Northeast India, and today she will be talking about the food politics and from the perspective of her work. Dr. Anamitra Ghosh Zosidar. I hope Anamitra is still introduced as Dr. Anamitra Ghosh Zosidar in professional platforms. This introduction remains slightly special because I think both of us completed our PhD degrees at the same time when she was a linguist, when she was only known as a linguist. Today, she is a critically acclaimed chef. She has her work has been, featured in various well-known food journals, food magazines, and mainstream media. She's a well-known chef, co-creator of an initiative, and I will call it an initiative and not a restaurant only. Co-creator of an initiative called Edible Archives, which is an ingredient-driven in the restaurant in the age of climate change. And rapidly depleting biodiversity. So first, we will go with, the order of the day would include that each speaker will get around 10 minutes, and around after 10 minutes, I'll just pass on a note, slip in a note in the chat box. I invite first Kiran Bhushi to reflect on, Dr. Bhushi to reflect on the politics of representation of local, particularly those categories of what is local, what is ethnic, and what is indigenous food from your work. Kiran, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ishita, for this very generous introduction. Very kind, I must say. Also, thank you very much to the Riksha, the body of students who seem to be always coming up with very exciting themes. I'm glad you thought of this theme because, as Ishita said, this is something we have reflected upon in our own everyday conversations, drawing room conversations, but this allows me to kind of think about in a very concise way, which is both difficult, but I will try. Both difficult and I think very slippery. So let me not waste any more time and I'll jump right into the said theme of the day. When I looked at the invitation and I was looking at this very brief synoptic note on what is the specific thing that they're looking at, some of the key words that struck me were local, ethnic, globalization, and capitalism. And I don't want to go into great detail about that. But I would like to sort of dwell on these two words very briefly, not so much as to unpack as much as to say that these are words at one level which are very common. We all seem to be familiar with the word local and ethnic, and yet they're very slippery. So this is what I want to talk about. I was at a seminar some time back, I think maybe about 3 years ago. It was a seminar on food, and there was a discussion on what is ethnic food. And again, it was not a paper that was being presented. It was one of those discussions after lunch. Now, the good thing about seminars on food is there is no end to the discussions. You finish the seminar, you continue your conversations through dinner, lunch, even when you're walking. So this was one of those discussions. And I remember a Japanese professor who was there, and she said, for us in Japan, ethnic would mean something that looked somehow very, very rich and has this very red curry look. And it really struck me, and I thought about it much later. And what I could glean from that simple statement was it somehow seemed we did have a further discussion on it, and the end result of that discussion was I've sensed that a lot of times the word ethnic in many of the places is used to indicate an otherness. So Mexican food in America would be the other till such time that Mexican food becomes American. Way back, I think it was Tony Blair, I forget who, said, yeah, curry is ethnic food. It's an immigrant food. And barely a decade later, curry was adopted as the official, uh, repertoire of cuisines for Britain. So I think the degree of otherness is, to me, is very indicative of when something gets to be called ethnic. Now, in India, we don't really use the word ethnic. We rarely ever say, oh, there is an ethnic restaurant, and that's ethnic food. Again, when I lived in the US, you had aisles which would say ethnic food. So that's where you go look for your, a miso maybe, or a dashi or something, for Japanese, or sometimes some other thing. Like I said, Mexican didn't, it wasn't there. Some of the regular sauces, which were already part of the American mainstream, had been moved out of the ethnic aisle and moved into the mainstream. And at that time, India was nowhere on the ethnic landscape, which is also very interesting because in the multicultural context, ethnic could mean a series of inclusions and exclusions. Now, that's as far as a very introductory, very fleeting glimpse from my point of view onto what is ethnic or how slippery it is. When it comes to India, I think the situation is even more complicated. We are not only multicultural, multicultural may not be the word that we use technically in terms of its political parlance, uh, but we are a diverse society. And since I use the word other, in the context of India, the other is constant shifting of politics. I mean, even in the context of America or anywhere, it is the shift of politics. So, to just give an example, I think something that's romanticized would easily acquire all the trappings of ethnic food, uh, but may not if that other is not romanticized. So, for instance, if Gordon Ramsay comes, does a TV show where, and chutney suddenly gets to be known in the mainstream media, then it might acquire a certain connotation of ethnic food, perhaps, because, it's so quaint and so nice, the tribals eat it. But if supposing a Dalit were to talk about some bread which is fermented for days on, would it really have the same romanticized connotations of ethnicity? I wonder. So I think there's definitely a sort of the kind of quotient, cool quotient that it acquires. In the age of hypermedia, in the age of marketability, of course, media mediated again, but also, market driven, as in capitalism. So there are all these questions, and uh, like I said, in the Indian context, the power politics are perhaps even more evident, right? So it again depends on context to context, and that is as far as a certain quotient that's a food or culinary repertoire acquires. But then there is also another word which popped up, which is local. Right. So I again want to dwell on it very briefly. Now, local is something. How do we pin locality? In again, we were not able to pin locality long back. Forget about the age of globalization. Even during colonialism, we were not quite able to pin locality in quite the way, because increasingly there's ample evidence that the first wave of globalization, or even I wouldn't say even the first one, but a equally widespread, prevalent form of globalization happened during colonialism. So we've already had massive exchange of commodities, particularly food. And the Colombian exchange, which is very famous, has given us chilies. Uh, I think for many of us Indians, chilies are as local as it can get. It's almost like if you look at half of the images coming from South Asia, the color red, indicative of the chilies, and and the piles of masalas everywhere. You realize that exoticized version of South Asia through its food always has chili and masala in it. So yes, it's not local, quite local, and yet it is local. But then globalization also creates its own eddies of how you look at global phenomena, which has its own local expressions. I think someone has done an excellent study of McDonald's, where each of these very globalized outfit has such local expressions. I remember eating a burger in Bangkok, and it was distinctly Thai. I mean, the original burger. Now, what is original anymore of the burger left? So globalization and local also have these very twin aspects which feed off each other. So as I said, I'm only trying to make things complicated by now dislocating the local, right? And yet, when you want to do studies which might be trying to bring out a context, we might have to engage with the idea of local. We might even have to engage with the idea of traditions. Even if you want to drop notions such as authenticity, and yet you do want to think about the context. Uh, how far do we go back into that context is also a very interesting question for sociologists. And I think I'm running out of time. Ishita, do I have any time, or I'm done with,
Two
I think I
minutes,
have
2 minutes.
1 minute.
Yeah.
So, like I said, these are all complicated questions. They're obviously implicated and mediated not only by the global processes of capitalism and globalization, but very specific contexts of power, right? I think I'll end it here. Thank you so much for my time.
Thank you. So moving on from, Kiran trying, making a very interesting, Kiran throwing us some very interesting questions in front of us of how do we dislocate the local, given that, the interpretations of ethnic food has also undergone a change. And I think one question we can stay with is, has there been a cultural appropriation while this change has undergone? And we stay with that idea of cultural appropriation, and we move to Dr. G's presentation. Novi, please go ahead.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Ishita, and I also want to thank the student initiatives of Riksha for in the Department of Sociology for inviting me to share a panel with panel here. Uh, what I'm actually going to do is I am going to talk about the food politics and by looking at fermented soya bean. So before I actually start, I want to actually make this statement that this work is based on the research that I'm currently working on and also based on my lived experiences of being a Simi in Nagaland. So the discussions on Ahone ranged the streets of Delhi and other metros for the second time in June and July 2020. The first time it was in 2000. The first time it was in 2017 when the Delhi police introduced a booklet titled "Security Tips for Northeast Students or Visitors in um, if you look at the booklet highlights on the food practices of the Northeast people in Delhi. It says that bamboo shoot, akhuni for fermented soya bean and other smelly dishes should be prepared without creating ruckus in the neighborhood. Now, the second time when the conversations around Akhoni entered the scene was with the movie release with the same name, Akhoni, which was released on 12 June 2020 on Netflix in the middle of the lockdown because of COVID-19 pandemic. It was also a time when the language of racism on the Northeast people in the metros were changing, where they were being called Corona, spat upon, asking them to go back to China because of the racial or facial similarities the Northeast people of India shared with the people of China, the source from which is traced the origin of coronavirus, and the pandemic that ensued and continued till now. So it is in this background that I would like to talk on the politics of food by bringing in fermented soya bean, food items known as ahone in Simi, a delicacy among the Nagas. So with the release of the movie Ahone, many people have been engaging in the debates around the movies and the issues that the movie was trying to deal with. But what is Ahone and what is its story? Before going further, I would like to engage with the etymology of the term ahoni, which has been in everybody's usage of late. So if you look at ahoni, ahoni is a Simi term for fermented soya bean cake, which is one of the staple food items in Simi dietary practices and food habits. The term ahone in Simi implies smell, and ne is a derivative of tone, which means strong or pungent. So if you look at the literal translations, it means a strong pungent smell. The Simi tribe also have the stories about the origin of ahoni and its usage, but that I will leave it for later times. Now, the Simi pronounce ahone with X literally, and because of the difficulties associated with pronouncing Simi's ahone resulted in the generic term Akuni, which is spelled as A-K-H-U-N-I, which is now being promoted or misrepresented as Naga or Nagamese term, the Creole of Nagas by some people, but no such term is found. Now, if you look at the different usage of fermented soya bean, which has actually of late becomes is gaining the pan Northeast identity in different cosmopolitan cities of India in recent times. It is known by different names across different tribes and regions, and the process and techniques of preparing and preserving also differs. So the climatic conditions of a place plays a very important role in the process of fermentations and the resultant taste and aroma. Fermented soya bean is known by different names among the different Naga tribes. So in Simi, it is called ahone. In the Angamis call it as dache or zasi. Among the Lotas, it is called nunkim, Hogyangsu in Sangtang, then Kasukui in Rongmai. Among the Aos, the Chongli groups calls it as Azungshi, and the Mungsung groups calls it as Chamesi. So if you look at the usage of fermented soya bean across the state borders, again, the Mizos call it as Bekam cookies as Detu. Among the Khasis of Meghalaya, the soya bean dish is known as Turumbai. It is also known as kinima across the Nepali-speaking parts of Himalayas and is consumed by, we see that it is consumed by communities stretching from Nepal to North Bengal. So, and if you look at Dolly Kikon's work, she talks about how fermented soya bean is an integral part of food across Eastern Himalayan societies. So we see that the fermented soya bean and its usage is not only found among the tribals in Northeast India, but also across Eastern Himalayas region and Southeast Asian communities. Now, if you look at Sidney Min's work, he talks about how the varieties of food and the process of preparing and preserving food among different human societies have got different kinds of attention, which sometimes horrifies the observers because of the process, techniques, and the substance uses are foreign, and the experience and eating habits are something that is different from them. So in this context, if we actually look at the fermented and smoked food, we see that it is a part of people's culture and identity among the Naga tribes. And every Naga tribe smoke and ferment different kinds of food items, such as fermented soya bean, bamboo shoots, fish, yam leaves, smoked meat, etc. So, despite the fact that if we actually look at the commonalities among the different Naga tribes, we see shared commonality, but at the same time, that we also see that there is specificity and specialty in preparations and techniques associated with each tribes. So, if you look at the owl tribes, the owls are known for fermenting yam or taro leaves, which is taro leaves, and making a smoke cake out of it. And they also have different names with it. So some groups of owls call it as anushi, some calls it as anishi, and some calls it as nushi. When it comes to bamboo shoot or bastenga, it is again a common food items across different Naga communities, but the dried version of bamboo shoot is the specialty of the lotas, which have a very distinct taste and texture. So if we actually look at all these, we come across where Arjun Appadurai makes this argument that food represents collective representations and also bears social messages. And if we actually look at the way in which food conveys message and the politics around it, we see that, we can see that it has certain functionality and social meanings attached to a particular food. It conveys the social facts and also bears social meaning. It identifies a particular tribe or community with unique knowledge and practices associated with its preparations and usages, and therefore it becomes a particular part of particular community's identity, as we can see in the case of Ahoni with the Simis, the Anishi with the Lothas, Pastenga or bamboo shoot Anishi with the owls, the Pastenga or bamboo shoot with the Lotas, and so on in Nagaland. Now, the next point that I want to actually come after saying this is to look at migration and food politics. Now, so what actually happened is that on the one hand, we see that food is central to people's identity and politics. And along with that, what we see is that with globalizations and huge migration, it is not just only the images and imagination that travels across times and space, but even the gastronomic sense. So the fermented soya bean delicacies travel across borders without a common name, and it is now known in the present state of Nagaland, in Northeast India, as well as in the metropolitan cities of India as Akni, a derivative from the Simis Ahone, which other Naga tribes pronounce it as Akuni because of the difficulties of pronouncing the X in Ahoni. Now, so what is actually happening is that when fermented soya bean and smelly food reaches the metros along with the Northeast migrants, it resulted in the Delhi police booklet with the security tips for Northeast people in 2007, advising them on what to cook in their personal kitchen spaces, the source from which the smell and aroma coming out from their kitchen was believed to be creating ruckus for their neighbors because of the smell that was alien or foreign to their nostrils and from the usual masalas and other food items. So it is important to note here that that some smell are considered acceptable while others are not. So, and what happened is that by highlighting that Northeast food are smelly and should be cooked with caution or cooked at the dead of the night to avoid disturbing the popular nostril, food racism and discrimination is sanctioned by the state in the form of Delhi police booklet. Now, in 2020, it is a different story, I would say, but let's see how different it is. So So the food landscape in Delhi and other metros have changed drastically with the huge number of migrants workers coming from northeast to the metros. Um, Arjuna Padrai talks about the two kinds of functions that food serves. First is the daily pressure to cook, daily pressure.
Noble, sorry to interrupt. We need to wrap up. So yeah.
Okay, so
Sorry.
okay, so I'll just So basically, what I want to actually say is that if you look at the way in which food has been traveling, it's interesting to look at how, with migration, all this food travels, and along with it, it creates a different kind of hierarchy which places the food of the northeast at the bottom because of the fact that it's smelly, it's considered outside the test palette of the mainstream, and also and through that resulted in them being calling names such as jungly, chinky, smelly, dirty, and recently corona. So what I wanted to actually bring in here is to say that and to connect it with what happened, to connect it with Ahoni. So if you look at the drama around the cooking of fermented soya bean in the movie Ahoni, instead of addressing the food and cultural difference and the issues of racism faced by Northeast people, it ends up reinforcing the same by looking at the subject of Northeast, their culture, food, and experience through the lens of the majority, with the exotic lens feeding into the interest of the majority audience. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lovi, for this very, 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 very insightful and interesting way to place the way in which state and food politics is actually interconnected and gives an entirely new meaning to the idea of quote unquote local. Right. On one hand, and this is particularly interesting, and many of our students who have still not been in Delhi. It's not that within Delhi, we do not have restaurants which sell Northeast food. And Akhuni is very much, fermented food is very much part of the menu. However, despite all of this, what Dr. Jimo's presentation actually indicates is the way in which, it's the way in which, state and food politics, particularly like governance around smell. And if you remember, many.
Sorry.
If you remember, if you remember the way in which, smell actually becomes, one of the anchoring ways through which that's the first, you first see the food and then you smell the food. The taste comes in much later for the consumer. So in a way, there's a sociality about the smell, and the perceptions around smell is often ignored in our sensory studies. Is a much later entry as far as our discipline is concerned, and therefore, and I think this is where Dr. Jimo's presentation around state and food politics, particularly from the angle of surveillance of smell, leaves us something to think about how local food gets interpreted by the state and by the migrants. Moving on to Anumitra Ghosh, I would request Anumitra, and I will invite her to comment on the practice of politics of representation of local marginal foods from your experience, Anumitra, as a chef with your first venture, Bentobong, and then moving on to in your capacity of curating various meals as part of your engagement with Diva and your journey of co-creating edible archives in Goa. So if you could reflect on the praxis of politics of representation through your understanding of sociology of menu.
Hi, thank you for calling me Ishita and Rickshaw as an initiative. This is a very important conversation, and I generally am not a person who talks a lot, but like sometimes it's important to also like talk about the work you are doing. Otherwise, it's very difficult, because with food, because it's an object, it comes and goes. So that there can be people who are trying to talk through food cannot be heard if it is not spelled out properly. I think our through Edible Archives, our initiative is to talk through our food, and if it is also important to talk sometimes. So we try to also talk about our food and why what we do and why what we do. So first, I'll tell you, like for last 10 years now, or more than 10 years, I've been working as a chef. And like the life before that, I was a PhD student and I was in academia. So this is a two completely different life, very very different from each other. I think that for the first half of my life, when I was understanding through linguistics, it was like first I understood that that standardization and the binaries between dialect, language, all these things are what. And then like sometimes you might all the different patterns of dialect can also create, sometimes if you are in a university or college and somebody is coming from another another background where they are speaking another dialect, sometimes that becomes a joke and all that. But with my actually linguistic training, that first time I understood that, like all these has no value, all the dialects are the same. And I think that was the first thing I will like to focus, because my whole journey is breaking the binaries in some ways. And I think that was the first thing. And then I was also I was very curious about religious studies. So I have read a lot of different kind of religious texts, because I was just curious, and I wanted to do a PhD also on that. So I was reading. But anyway, that is also another kind of binary. Also, I have practiced, like as a student, I was part of a student movement. I was part of like the communist student party. So that is another boundary, the binary, where you meet communism, like when communism you learn in certain way, and then you like where you learn to like first disregard all the religious things, and then you start religion, and then you see that they in some ways they are also talking about the same thing in a different voice. And like then by the time I was doing my PhD, all these like all these things were already, like all the binaries were becoming like completely not there. And then also gender, because like it's like when as a queer person, if you are trying to work in any kind of industry where you are dealing with people, you are like we are in an industry where we are constantly visible. Whether I am cooking in the kitchen, I'm talking to chef, and then you also negotiate with your team, because in professional kitchen, if you are a good cook, you are a bad cook, doesn't matter. The whole team becomes your part of your body, and all of them together, then you cook. It is not your own initiative. It's like somebody is my hand, somebody is my eyes, and then we as a team create something. So negotiating, and we work in a very small kitchen always. Wherever you work, I have worked in all over the world, and everywhere kitchens are generally small and very, like physical proximity is a very important thing. How do you negotiate gender? And so all these things are constantly, the binaries were just getting blur. And then with Edible Archives, we decided that let's start talking about something where what is local, what is global, what are the cuisines. So we picked up a very different tone to talk about food, because say I'll give you concrete examples which might not, like I'm talking about practical things because you know what I deal with every day. So say last couple of years, when you come to Goa, so my restaurant is in Goa and I'm dealing with many fishermen communities and many other communities here. So last couple of years, when I was doing my Reikis and I was just going back, I was trying to find more fishermen, having relationship with the communities. I figured out that like everybody comes to Goa to eat seafood. One of the major seafood is everybody comes here and have surmai kingfish. You know, this year, like I think last month, I understood that lot. I was reading a very important document with some environmentalists that I work with, and then we figured out that some of the surmais for last few years are coming from Korea. They are so-called local in Goa. Everybody comes here to eat local food in Goa, and then they go to local small restaurants. Now, I'm not talking about big ones. Everybody use surmai, but I'm talking about small fish thali places where you go and have the best ethnic representation of Goan food, and you have a Korean this thing surmai. This is the rice part, fish part of it. Now I'll come to the rice part of it because Goa is also famous for fish and rice. So in Goa, when I used to come here, like say 15 years ago, I always remember that I went to the market and I picked up the local rice. So last year I was we were giving a talk on Goan rice. So we did a research like for 6 months, and while working on that project, we realized that there are two there are two Goan rice which are cultivated now, like almost 80 to 85% of the the cultivation is of this rice called Jaya and Jyoti. Whatever, when you come to Goa and buy from a local market in Mapsa, you buy the most the old Goan aunties are selling local rice, and you buy this rice, and they are Jaya and Jyoti, which are actually they are coming from Pusa Institute. In Pusa Institute, these two rice were created, and they are now like the government is also giving free seeds every year to everyone to grow them. And now almost like we were also trying to find out rice because we connect farmers who wants to grow local rice and all that. So this year we after a year of work, we could only get two kinds of seed. One we are growing in our own in the restaurant. We have a small garden. And then, sorry, Ishita is telling Pusa Institute in Delhi. Did I say Goa? Sorry.
For students, who are not familiar where Pusa Institute is, they would miss out the irony that, Delhi,
Yeah.
The seed is being grown here, transported there, transplanted, and all of that, that's why.
Yeah, it's not like in the sense that the seed is actually, it's a hybrid seed which is made in Pusa Institute, and using all the other things, like you do a dwarf variety because it has certain kind of facilities. If you don't want a labor in intensive agriculture, that kind of thing, that's a different story. So I'm saying that now, how do you work? Because we also actually try to work with local ingredients. So it's a very, very tough thing. So I think it's the only way to going forward is just to be conscious and constantly ask this question, and don't take anything for granted, because we are not in that kind of I have seen that, say, in China, you cannot again we were working in we were trying to understand rice varieties, where it is grown, which variety in China. It's a very, very difficult this thing. But you take the same question in Japan, and it is little better, because they are in Japan you see much more clarity on it's also about the consciousness. It's about your politics, that whether you want it to be the question or not to be the question. And this is not a like there is no static answer to it. This is a very dynamic question. This year something might be local, might be actually something which is, sorry, this year something can be that it is, you are thinking it's local, but next year you can find it's this. Or also it can happen that this year you know that this is not a local thing. This is, say, I'll give you another example of, say, something which grows in Goa. I'm giving you a Goa centric examples because I work here. So I'll give you another example where what which one, a vegetable which was not actually very much into Goa, this thing, but now it has become um, like even like corn was a vegetable, was not growing, or cauliflower was not a vegetable, was growing in Goa like even 10 years ago, but now you see that that has become local. So even, or the rice example I was telling you, that which was done in Pusa Institute, of Goa. In Goa, there is a word which has which is used. It's called gauti. Gauti means local. So actually, the gauti rice here is Jaya and Jyoti, which I just told you that this is coming. I'm almost done. And so what I'm saying, that just keeping the question on is very important, because right now we are not in a place where from government there is any initiative, or there are other bodies which, or other institutions which are actually monitoring this kind of thing. So if you want to know what is local, what is not local, you have to keep on asking the question where it is coming from, what is the root, and like for vegetable and other things, what are the seeds, are we are up, like we are very edible archives is very seed oriented thing. So if we get a rice, we first try to understand what seed is it, from where it is coming from, is there any kind of mixing has happened. So I think that the, like, the concept of local is generally, now it has become quite blurred. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Anamitra, for sharing your praxis of politics of representation and your challenges to work with the idea of quote unquote local. Also, one thing becomes very, very important through Anamitra's presentation is the question of, ecology. And why the question of ecology becomes important, because there are ways of, and we can have a completely different discussion that requires a slightly different discussion. There are these discussions around geographical niche, that this product is associated with this geographical niche. However, and as students of sociology, as students of economic anthropology, we know that food biographies have very interesting backstories of several geographies that go on in the making of a food biography. One, of course, you have the story of sugar, right? The story of sugar is not only about, the story of sugarcane, as Siblings would tell you, but it is also about the beetroot sugar. It is also about how different forms, how at different historical junctures, colonial powers kind of, had a role to play vis-a-vis the way in which sugar came to be perceived as part of the British diet. And if sugar wouldn't have been successful without the rise of, tea drinking culture and the industrial working class. Similarly, what Anamitra is saying is that, and I think it's important to keep that key example in our minds, that, in that fish thali, what is important is that a symbolic value that the kingfish has for a consumer as a local food. However, its backstory of supply chain capitalism actually will tell you that it is that it comes from Korea. And similarly, of course, cauliflower, capsicum, you name any of the vegetables that we call our own, much of the vegetables, and potato, for heaven's sake, which I'm sure you're served in hostel, which you will be served in the hostel very soon, whenever whenever you join the university. So on that note, I think the way in which food and power is closely linked. I think three important takeaways, and then I'll open the floor for discussion. One is, of course, uh, starting with the question of ecology. Can we also review seed as life, right? And this is an idea that is not mine. This is an idea that is you can read it up by Debal Deb, who talks about that the idea of seed as life. Can you really look at that? Moving from seed, if we really look at the processes of cooking, and you have four elements, right? Within that four elements, if you really take into account air, I think air really has a very, very important role in the way in which, smell, particularly the way in which, fermentation processes are at work, right? And of course, food technology experts would tell you that there is also a certain kind of microbial life that needs to be studied when we talk about fermentation processes. However, as students of sociology, how do those fermented products get perceived, and how fermented products of a certain kind becomes part of state surveillance is something to be remembered. Moving on to the first thing, thereby, how do we understand the shifting meanings of what local and ethnic food is? This is what Kiran actually began with. That how do we really that if ethnic food, and in her presentation she said if ethnic food was constructed around the idea of otherness, how do we really understand the shifting meanings of ethnic and ethnic food and local food? And is it important to dislocate the local? I will now give over the floor to Aryaman and Ankita. And as they said, three of the presenters, not because, they are friends and there are some people, have worked with, they'll be open to your questions, comments, and suggestions. You're welcome to, write your questions and comments in the chat room, which we could then direct to this thing. And I really thank three of you from three different parts, literally. One from the hills, one from near the sea, and Lovi, are you in Delhi? Lovi, are you in Delhi based right now? Yes. And Lovi and I are in Delhi. So literally, thank you for joining, despite the technological glitch, we were thinking that, that did not happen. So really thank you. And I open the floor to questions and comments. Over to Ankita and Aryaman.
If anybody has any questions or comments, please drop them on the chat box and we can take 3 to 4 questions at a time. I think we have a question for Kiran ma'am by Sangeeta. I can read it out for you.
Yeah, please.
It says, hi Kiran, you were starting to talk about authenticity that's linked to local and ethnic identity. Please elaborate.
Oh, well, given the time frame, I don't think elaboration is possible.
Like I said, both the word local as a concept and even in practice is very difficult to fix. As much as we have notions of identity, a sense of we feeling that Lovi was talking about in terms of how Akuni connects the various tribes of the Northeast or the Eastern Himalayan region. These they can be label, they can be identity markers to some extent. We would like to, let's say, pin certain items to a certain community. If you look at the beef politics in the recent past, both Dalits and Muslims have been at the center of the beef controversy. And the very fact that they both have adapted it as a badge of their identity is one indication of how one can look at in this case, ethnicity in terms of religion or caste, as one way to. But then again, if you really look at it carefully, then it's not necessary that all Dalits eat beef or that they only eat beef, right? It's a very complex question because identities are constantly being made and remade. Having said that, now I'll come to the question of authenticity. In a very similar way, how far can we go back to origins for it to be uh, regaled as something authentic? For instance, idli, which is somehow seen as the most indicative dish of South India, or actually, I wouldn't say South India, it's very specific to Tamil Nadu. Somebody might say this is the authentic way it is made, but once you start questioning that authenticity, it might be revealed that actually idli is not necessarily from India, or that a particular variety of idli is made in different ways in different contexts. So authenticity is also imagined, is what I would say. It can be imagined in various metaphors. It can be used in different kinds of tropes are used. I think um, Tanushri Bhaumik, I was reading her article. I mean, she very beautifully captures that, how, you know, when you say a grandmother's recipe, somehow it rings authentic, you know. For all you know, the grandmother must have got it from some neighbor who's actually come from England and who has creolized it so much that it is not at all original, you know, but just it happens to be coming from your grandmother, or that it comes from an ancient text. So we have different ways of imagining authenticity, is what all I can say at this point. Thank you.
Okay, we can go to the question by Ishita ma'am, and ma'am asks, this is a question directed to Anumitra ma'am. In your experience of curation of local food, how do you negotiate with the risks of cultural appropriation?
Um, Look, recently I don't try to like actually can you just send me the question, because then I'll be more to the point. Just send it to me.
Ma'am, it's there in the chat box. I can.
Okay, then I'll just look for it, because it's I want to give. Okay. Yeah. Curation, local food, how do you negotiate with the risk of cultural appropriation? Right. So actually, from the time I started Edible Archives in Kochi, I am trying to not actually do anything specific, in the sense that I am trying to do, which is like you pick up ingredients and then you combine them. That might be, you know, like I they are not they are not exactly fusion, but they are. I talk about, okay, if it is a like say posto, but I do also like posto is a Bengali thing which is made with poppy seeds, but you know in Bengal we don't make cauliflower posto, but I do it, or beetroot posto, but I do it. So I don't want to confine to, I just pick up the idea and then break it down, and then I work with that. And but then certain thing I try to claim, actually certain things I am very, I just try to also put a cultural connotation to it. Like in my last menu I did something called Nazreen chicken. Now why this Nazreen was mentioned. So Nazreen was my friend from Assam, but she represents a Muslim community from Assam, and like the food is also, it's not like people have a certain idea, okay, Muslim food is like this, but that is also there are regional variations. So that, and I wanted to put that, and in my whole menu there is no mention of any other, okay, this is from here or this thing from here, there was no mention like that. But in this case, in the when, because NRC and all CA was going on, I felt that like there should be some kind of representation which is not overt, like it's there, it will give you a small like a small kind of a window to think and to question. So I keep that kind of information, but I generally don't try to do any kind of right now I don't do much that okay this kind of thing or this kind like I'm doing go on food, the Bengali food, though I have done all of them. But now I'm like I also think that my mentor once told me, Ritu Ralvia, that if you are a chef, you are a chef. You are not Japanese chef, you are not Bengali chef, you are a chef. You are in the kitchen, whatever, like when you are in a Bengali kitchen, you are cooking Bengali food, you are a chef, you just conceptualize. So I think it's like that. Right now, that is the situation, but it's also keep on changing. So maybe next year I'll say something else.
We have a question from Sakshi. He has asked about the relationship of food and emotions. So if anyone would like to pick it up.
Sorry.
He asked about the relationship between food and emotions, particularly because food politics has resulted in hurting a lot of sentiments in the recent times. So if anyone would like to take it up.
Ankita is asking to comment on food and emotions, like, because food is also about, like collective emotions, representations, and it's hurting the sentiment. So, how do we really understand, food and emotions? And any one of you, this is what you wanted, right? Any one of you, if any one of you could, comment on the linkage between food and emotions.
Maybe I can comment on this. So, what when I was actually talking about food and I was actually talking about the smell, I was also trying to talk about how when we're actually talking about food, it actually conveys strong emotions. And in this context, what I wanted to actually say is that with migrations, with northeast migrants coming to the metros, along with them, food also came. And what actually ends up happening is that on the one hand, we come across a situation where there is I'm sorry, my background, there are lots of dog barking, so the background sound might be disturbing. So what is actually happening is that on the one hand, if you look at the way in which different kinds of inequalities and racism is experienced by the people from the northeast, what actually happened is that when you cook a particular food which is supposed to be smelly and unacceptable to the other, but it also gives you a sense of belonging, right? It gives you a sense of belonging somewhere, and through the cooking and consuming of this food, it produces the emotions where it gives you a sense of belonging, and it also makes you feel that through the smell, the aroma that comes out of the food, which is actually familiar with you, also helps you to identify yourself with certain food, certain people, certain place. So in that context, definitely it also is connected to hurt emotions. At the same time, it also has these connections which connects you to the larger community, or which actually makes you feel that you belong somewhere.
Thank you, Lovitoli ma'am. Next, we have a question by Mahua on diaspora and the idea of diaspora. So I'll go to Kiran ma'am with that question, since you have worked on the idea of diaspora. And Mahua asks that there is a way in which local taste is acquired for others. And since she's from the Northeast, she has noticed a lot of similarity between the Assamese cuisine and Thai cuisine. For example, usage of sticky rice, usage of banana leaves, preference for steamed cooking. So, can local cuisines gain a necessary support from these countries? And what role does diaspora have to play in the way that these food items are similar between nations, between countries?
Sorry, my phone was on mute. Wow, this is a very tricky question. That seems like a question for the Ministry of External Affairs. I mean, in some ways, no, I don't mean to dismiss it. What I mean is, as far as internation connectivity is there, that's always been there. Whether there is diaspora or something. See, food is one of those things which has no borders. It's actually very porous. You know, people will adapt, and borrow from each other all the time. And we do that intuitively. So the diaspora in America, when they can't find the right jaggery, they will go to the Mexican stores. Similarly, they'll look for goat meat there than anywhere else. So these affinities are there across, always. And we are constantly looking for those affinities, right? So the role of diaspora, I maybe I didn't understand the question. It needn't be the diaspora, but perhaps what you're saying is because of affinities, we can actually have dialogue, which through the metaphors of food, have larger dialogue where the culinary congruences can be then nurtured or honed. I suppose that's what the question is. Yes, definitely the diaspora can have a role, but diasporas tend to be, by definition, also very nation-centric. You know, because part of the idea of a diaspora is that you're always missing home. This imaginary home is what drives your imagination around food and all that. So congruences are perhaps not on their mind as much. That's what I would think. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you. Next, we have a question for Anumitra ma'am. So we'll go to Anumitra ma'am now. Ishtan asks, how would you negotiate the procurement of local produce being used in the dishes being catered to a certain class alone? An example of the same would be India's increasingly export-oriented agricultural market or production.
Procurement local produce being used in dishes being catered to a certain class alone. Can you
It's there, ma'am.
explain
It's
that?
there in the chat box if you want to have a
No,
look at the
I'm
question.
reading that, but I didn't understand that what is about the class thing here. Mm,
Okay,
can you
Ishan,
explain, Ishita?
If you're there with us, can you unmute yourself and explain the question or elaborate a bit?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, so what I meant by the procurement process was basically given that some restaurants or let's say establishments kind of on a contractual basis ask uh, either fisheries or farm fisheries to kind of produce a type of local produce that goes like let's say because the establishment is quite has a lot of capital that they're uh, able to command the supply chain for that particular establishment alone in the local community. So how would one kind of negotiate that with it being used in that establishment being let's say that establishment caters to a particular class, how would one negotiate in with that, if that makes it clear? Otherwise it's fine. I mean,
It's not very clear, but I'm anyway, whatever I have understood, I'm answering from that perspective. So I think that Kiran, you are looking. Did you understand the question? Okay, I think I'll just answer. So, basically, how I try to work is that I have my local vendors. I'm trying to use as much local vendors as possible. Recently, I read something in Delhi, what is happening, that somebody has opened a big delivery service with where the main focus is that US based chicken is coming from the US. Somebody like you, the chicken is coming, and that is the focus of that delivery. So we work exactly opposite of that. We try to use like local, in the sense the closest of my restaurant, like 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, we don't have any chicken farm, but somebody locally gets it for me. And like, and what we do is that, because you also have to create something. Look, when people pay for food, you have to also give that kind of like, it's not that when you are cooking at home and you are serving 10 friends, they will be very happy to eat whatever you give, everybody will praise. But you know, when people pay for it, you have to create something. So we use lot of ingredients which are like, it's a balance between what you can get locally, and then other things also you get, like say soya sauce, you can't get a local this thing. But then you make something with, then you can use a technique which might be coming from Japan or from Korea, and then you elevate that and make something else. So I don't know whether it gives any answer to the question, but this is, I like, anybody can ask any specification if I have not answered the question properly.
Okay, we can come back to this. Shall we go on to Lovitoli ma'am? You have two questions for you, which I'll be sort of combining into one. So Sudatta and Trideep ask. So it's a two-part question. The first part is, while the film Akhuni did have problematic notions and glitches, is it not true that cinematic representation of this kind is needed for the popular mass to know about food items like Akhuni in the first place? So how do we navigate this understanding of having an item from the Northeast which is unfamiliar with Akhuni, unfamiliar, and how do you make sense of cinematic representation, introducing that to the popular mass? And the second question from Trideep says that, while the food choices of Northeastern people have been subjected to xenophobia and racism, it's also true that the same kind of xenophobia exists within communities within the Northeast. So he gives an example of the caste Hindu Assamese or Bengali people in Assam who speak ill about tribal communities of the region because of their food choices. So how do we make sense of this? So if you could, reflect on both these questions.
So, to come back to the movies on Akhuni and its representation, the cinematic, one thing we have to be very clear is that if you look at the politics of food, the smelly food has been in the language, right? Has been in conversations in Delhi for a very long time. It's not something that is new. And what is actually happening is also the way in which, there is the fact that racism is practiced, the fact that there is discrimination, right? And these discriminations are also based on, say, physical features, based on food practices. If you go back to 2007 and look at the Delhi police booklet, it's very much there in the open. So these are very, very sensitive issues, right? And when you actually, and if you have watched the movie Akhuni, when you actually go to the extent of dramatizing to such an extent that, in order to cook, the way in which it is represented is very problematic. Why? Because you're actually reinforcing the stereotype that is there, where, the smelly food of the Northeast is considered as the other, which cannot be cooked even within your private space or within your private kitchen, because it disturbs the nostril of the other. So in that context, when you're actually dealing with an issue as sensitive as this, and you're actually reinforcing the stereotype that is already there, it is definitely problematic. So the way, so I would not want to comment on the way in which, the cinematic representation, but the issue, the problem is the core of the issue, which has been, which is supposed to actually address the question of racism and discrimination faced by the people you end up reinforcing that discrimination by bringing in by looking at it through the lens of the majority, by thinking of the larger audience, whether it's acceptable or not acceptable. So that's one. The second important aspect that I also want to comment is on say xenophobia. So definitely, like racism is actually, or xenophobia is actually prevalent everywhere. But in that context, I am at no point saying that, the people in the region, the Northeast people in the Northeast are not racist. In fact, we may be more racist, but we're also talking about a situation, a context in which, we have a huge migrant population coming to the metros in Delhi, where based on your food consumption, based on your look, there is a racism that is practiced, which is also enforced by the state. And that's where, we have to look at the issues. And that's where it becomes very important. So that's when I was actually talking about how the movie Akhuni itself was released in a situation where racism was already there, but it was taking a different language where people were even spat at, or they were being called corona because of the fact that there is certain physical similarities with China, the origin of corona, right? So these are something that we have to really look at and try to problematize it and look at the complexities of it.
Okay, thank you, Lovitoli ma'am. We have a question from Ishita ma'am on directed to Anumitra ma'am, and it it's oh, okay. No, okay. So this question is directed to it's on power politics by Prashant, and we can take this up. Kiran ma'am, can you please take this question, and then we can go to Anumitra ma'am with a later question. So this question on power politics, Prashant asks: is it possible to look at politics in food, separating it from the larger politics or political process? If communities are marginalized in terms of power, politics, and representation in mainstream academia as well as culture and the arts, their foods automatically get less traction. So the larger public never gets aware of these foods because they never get a space in these arenas. So I think the root of the question is what is the separation between food and the larger political process?
There is no separation, I think. I think food is a reflection of the society. In every sense, if there are caste hierarchies, there are hierarchies of food. The dry fish that poor people eat, it's particularly stinky in South India, and it's not necessarily eaten by some of the upper caste. There are vegetables which are considered palatable only for the poor. So it's rife. In fact, Lovi raised a very important question that even the so-called democratic societies and so-called secular societies inherit these notions around food unwittingly or deliberately, so much so that it translates into various policies, various directives, various surveillances and legislations. I'll just give you this example. The ex-director of National Institute of Nutrition says this, that in the beginning, when India became independent, sometimes in the 50s, they were trying to come up with a minimum requirement of nutrition for children and for adults. And various studies have pointed out that in the ration supplies, there should be some kind of animal protein, at least eggs. She says, but somehow that thing was never picked up because our policymakers were Brahmanical, actually Brahmins, who thought that it was not necessary. We're not going into the environmental debate here or the actual nutritional value, but that they come from a certain vantage point is evident in everything that food is about.
it's evident, you know. So I think there is no separation.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Next, we have two questions for Anumitra, ma'am. Pretty interesting. One is I'm combining Akshat's question and Manuram's question. So Akshat asks that the idea of fusion food today is generally perceived as an innovative measure in the globalized world we live in today. But on the other side, critics call it cultural appropriation. So how do we deal with this paradox? This is the first aspect of the question. The second question by Manoram asked that, when you're preparing food at Edible Archives in Goa, have you ever been criticized of not preparing a food properly? Have you met with a cultural, ethnic, or local critique that it's not properly made? So how do we navigate this tricky situation without hurting people's sentiments?
So I'll first answer the Manoram's question because it's exactly what we discussed in our briefing in the before the service kind of briefing situation, where we discuss this with our managers who handles this complicated guests. And as an F&B, as a F&B rule, we always say it's my fault. Okay, if you don't like something, it's our fault, and we will try to replace your this thing. You can order anything else, but you never engage in a conversation where you are trying. First, it's not about hurting people. You cannot if somebody is coming to your restaurant, it's our restaurants are like people are coming, it's an extension of your house, where people have if somebody guest has come, you have to make them happy. That's the base rule, that you cannot hurt anybody. Next is that, yes, I have heard these questions especially from Bengalis, and I generally I have faced this. Now the thing is that I have also conceptualized it in this way, that when, say, again, I'll give a example from my linguistic experience, because I think language and food works very much like you can give a parallel to these things. So like if some Bengalis, like if they pronounce for bus, somebody can pronounce bash. Now when I was when I was very young, I used to also one of them who used to make fun of that. And but then I realized that this is another kind of pronunciation. It's a variation within the language. Similarly, food is also like constantly, it is different kind of variation within a same cuisine, what people practice, and then also that they cook. So, there is no way that there is only one way of doing anything, especially with food. So there is no observation. And if I find the question, asked in a very interesting way, then I try to extract the recipe instead of, hurting or sentiment, this thing. I try to extract the recipe. Okay, which one is the recipe that, you would love to eat? And if that is a good recipe, I will try and I'll get going. Now, the next question was, can you repeat the question? That was also very interesting. That was
by Akshat Sharma. He's asking the idea of fusion food, and it's perceived as an innovative measure in India today, in the globalized world we live in. But critics call that critics may term it as cultural appropriation. So there's a paradox which is happening.
Look, I understand. I also see and I observe a lot of people where, I'll give another example. I have seen that there is a dish which is like cooked, say, duck curry. I saw somebody's this thing recipes, that duck cooked with bamboo shoot, and it's a Bengali recipe, innovative Bengali recipe. Now, I understand completely that this was never in any Bengali repertoire. It's a Assamese dish, and it's a like complete cultural this thing appropriation. So that kind of thing is one thing that also is happening constantly. But then there are also things that which are shared by many cuisines. Say mustard fish. there is a way of doing mustard fish in Bengal. There is a way of mustard. I am sure that there are many ways of doing mustard fish in Bengal, in Bihar, in Odisha. Now, which one is the authentic and this thing? So, I personally, if you ask me this question, I have again taken a concept from linguistics and came up with an interesting idea, which is that there is something called what is it called, the language of one, like there is always a personal language which is called a idiolect. So idiolect is something which is a language of your own. So what I feel that I always try to mimic idiolect. So I don't get into concept of whether it's this cultural this thing. I pick up from this person's personal recipe, and then you develop that. Or actually, we don't develop. What I do is standardize that, because I don't cook everything myself. So we standardize that. But I tried to again take something from linguistics, and I have come up with this answer for this question, that I try to personally do with idiolect. But the cultural appropriation is happening, and I think that we should always have a conversation around it. Like when we see this kind of thing, just let's not just appreciate and say, oh, wow, that's a wonderful Bengali initiative. It's not. So let's keep the conversation on.
All right. Thank you, Anumitra ma'am. We have one last question for Lovitoli ma'am, and then we can head on to sort of, the concluding remarks, and then, we'll try to have a conversation between each of the speakers at the end. And after we conclude, we can call it a day. So Lovitoli ma'am, this question is from Ishita ma'am, and she asked that in your work on fermented foods, do you feel that there is a hierarchy of how this fermented food is perceived? So, for example, dosa is a fermented food. You gave the example of akhuni. So, what is the hierarchy that we that comes to when we talk about fermented foods?
So I must first say that, my research on food has been, put a disclaimer that my research on food has been only around the Northeast food. So I've not really thought about it. So that's a disclaimer that I must put. But at the same time, what I also wanted to say is that when we're actually talking about fermented food and politics around it, it's also important for us to, we also see that there is an intersections of different categories there. So along with food, culture, people, race, gender, there is an intersection there. And and I was actually, when I saw that question, I was thinking of Joy Pachwa's work, where in her book on Being Mizo, she talks about how when the residents in Munirka were asked, how do you look at the South Indian and North Indian and Northeast? There is some of the respondents that came across was saying that despite the fact that there is a difference between South Indian and North Indian, you can still identify them as one of you. But when you come to the Northeast, they are not a foreigner nor an Indian, so they don't find a way to describe them as being an odd community. So in this context, what I want to actually say is also to look at the way in which, we identify, or the way in which we identify people, community, group, culture, and place them at a hierarchy is not a standalone category, but it also intersects with different categories, which has a larger bearings or meanings and around the food politics. So let's say dosa and akhuni. Interestingly, if you look at it, when I actually see your question, I'm thinking around it. The fact that I stay in this part of the country in North India, but I definitely enjoy eating North Indian food, but I also like eating dosa, and I have not come across a situation, or maybe I'm mistaken, where dosa as a fermented food creating problems or becoming a central part in identity politics, as is with the case of fermented food from Northeast. I hope that answers the question.
That does. Ankita and I have a concluding question, and after that, we'll hear from all of you, and then we'll wrap up. So, Ankita asks that there is a way in which ethnic foods, in their negotiation with the mainstream, have to undergo a certain kind of acceptance or a certain kind of validation. So, how do we come in with this, of this ethnic or local food being validated by the mainstream? So there is that element, and I want to take the question to to a slightly more sociological direction. And if I can try to bring in Foucault and the microphysics of power, the capillary action in which power is distributed and foods are placed within this mediation in heterogeneous spaces. Maybe we can begin with Ishita ma'am, perhaps, or any of the speakers, and then we can hear from each of the speakers, and then we can move on to the conclusion.
As far as, let's put it this way, and I think, one way of answering, combining your question and Ankita's question is to also look at the way in which, knowledge production around food works. And one interesting vignette is to look at the politics of cookbooks. Who writes these cookbooks? In which language it is written? What kind of cookbooks get written in local languages? What kind of cookbooks get written in languages so that other people can also read it? If you really, there was to answer the question, I would give one example and stop here. I think last to last year, and my other colleagues on the panel would correct me if I'm wrong, there was a cookbook that came about from one of the regions, from one of the Dalit communities in Maharashtra by an author in Marathi, and there is only one another attempt by the SNDT University in Pune, which was headed then by Sharmila Rege, where as part of a gender studies course, they had put together food biographies and food recipes. How do you really look at, and let's put it this way, on one hand, you have a cookbook that is written by an insider, like in sociology, we say it's a representation from an insider. And in the other case, I do not know the backgrounds of the students, but clearly there was a very interesting weaving of the biographies of the people who were writing about the recipes, and this has a certain politics, in the way in which that entire cookbook was curated by the SNDT University Gender Studies, I think, department. Because this is what, Anumitra was saying, that, when she decided to put in her friend's name, because there is also, this thing that, you have, that comes from a politics of, she used the word, acknowledgement, I would say politics of recognition, right? And it is as it is, you don't recognize that's your problem. Your law is crappy, you don't want to recognize that's your problem, but this is how it is. So I think the way in which knowledge around food production, particularly through cookbooks, because there's a certain bookishness to cookbooks. Cookbooks are not really just merely, they're very living archive of marking the boundary of a community. And in that sense, in the marking of the boundary of a community, also your caste gets reproduced, class gets reproduced, gendered identity gets reproduced. But can cookbooks become cultures of resistance? And I think, SNDT Women's Universities, I think it was a gender studies course where this particular cookbook was put together. That particular cookbook, that particular endeavor, and Sahu Patole's cookbook can be read as two initiatives which can also look at cookbooks as mode of resistance.
I want to add one more cookbook. I think you can see that it's called. It was part of Haravi Biennale. It's called the Indecisive Chicken.
Chicken. Yeah.
It's done in English and Hindi. I like it's very rare. If somebody wants, I can send some photos of the book because it's not that available. But it's a very interesting book. It's a like photographically and how it's written also.
I just want to add one small thing. In a to drive this point, I'm coming up with a very extreme example. Now, politics of representation is tricky when you look at very neutral communities. When I say neutral, I mean there's not been a huge history of oppression or something. But when it comes to oppression, food is a metaphor of that oppression as well. So what better way than the one who experienced to speak about it? I mean, this debate has come up in various other aspects as well. Who represents queer people? Who represents women? This is a sociological question that is at large. But again, I'm giving this example. Like, if you were to say, write about food around pregnancy, right? I think it would be a bit strange for a man to go about to write about this book. I mean, I'm using the word strange. I'm not saying it cannot be done. I think, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Can I come in here? Sorry, I mean, Prashant was asking, I'll just, I had just one line comment to make, does ethnic food really need to be accepted by mainstream? I think it's important to revisit the question, more in terms of mainstream, how a certain food gets identified as ethnic food, because depending on geographies, mainstream also changes. And this is something, often we forget, right? Like probably, kingfish might not be the mainstream, in some other parts, even in the part where fish is eaten, right? So ethnic, the ideas, the shifting markers of ethnic food, I think as students of sociology, I would be slightly careful with, or I'll mark what are the shifting markers of ethnic food. So the shifting markers of ethnic food could be, as blatant as the look and feel of the food. I mean, orange colored food or red colored food being identified as Indian, quote unquote, Indian food. Or that tomato-ish gravy, for heaven's sake, tomato, there's there is a global history of tomato. I mean, without colonization, tomatoes wouldn't have become part of our cuisine, right? But half of our gravies are, so how do you really, more than acceptance of ethnic food, I think the shifting markers of ethnic food, and that has to do with the class question as well. And class really plays an important role, I feel, in that how ethnic also becomes, what kind of ethnic food also becomes trendy. And this is where I think class, we cannot escape the class question. Sorry. I mean, this question came in, that's why I answered.
So I also wanted to come in briefly to actually look at, talk about politics of food and representation and power, and to also connect it with, the question of acceptance and validation of food. So, and in order to look at that, I'm specifically talking about Northeast food, the food that comes from Northeast into the metros in Delhi, right? So what I wanted to actually say is also to look at, if you look at the situation in 2020, there seems to be things seems to have changed, where there seems to be a certain form of acceptance of Northeast food, where you come across different kinds of restaurants and eateries being opened up across, to specifically look at Delhi's, we have so many restaurants and eateries which are actually catering to Northeast food, and they also seem to be doing very well. But one thing that I come across is also to look at the way in which food are categorized. So what is actually happening is that in the metros, we see that, we see that many young people, like many people, go to the restaurants which caters to Northeast food and enjoy, with friends and enjoy it. And we also enjoy it. At the same time, there's also this peer pressure, of being in the metropolis to find acceptance among the peers. So they go out and enjoy it, but it's considered as uncultured food, which you cannot go take it to your kitchen, to take it to your space, which belongs to you, to your family, and eat. So in that sense, on the one hand, at the surface level, there seems to be a larger acceptance, but if you look deeper, there's also a categorization of food where, certain food you can actually enjoy it, consume it, and also because of the peer pressure that is there to, present yourself in certain ways. But when it comes to identifying yourself with it, because of the fact that it's placed at a different level of hierarchy, you cannot actually take it within that space, within your familial space, within your cultural space to identify yourself with.
Okay, so I think we don't have any new questions, and so we can call it a day. Um, uh, on behalf of Rickshaw, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, um, and all of the audience that have joined us here today for being a receptive and interactive audience. This has been a very stimulating discussion, and I believe we have had a lot of takeaways from this discussion. With that being said, this brings us to the end of our event. Thank you so much, speakers, for joining. We are immensely grateful. Thank you, Ishita ma'am, for sharing, and thank you, the audience as well. Hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Thank you so much. It indeed
Thank
was
you.
a
Thank
exciting
you
talk.
very much. Yes. Very engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.